as Ida said, I'm Rebecca. I'm a research fellow here at this school. I've been here about a year, more than a year now. And so I'm really excited to be here to talk about LINEA, which is the project that I work on. So LINEA stands for the Learning Initiative on Norms, Exploitation, and Abuse. And it's got a lot of different pieces, but the main gist of it is that it's a project that is oriented towards exploring whether social norm theory, or using social norms, changing social norms, can be an effective method to prevent the sexual exploitation of children. And so today I'm going to give an overview of the project. I think it's kind of interesting because it's got a lot of different pieces. So some is research in the traditional sense, but then there's some other different types of activities. So I'll talk about that. And then I can share some of the very early findings, is conceptual clarity or learning about the topic. The second is developing a network, the LINEA network, of researchers and practitioners who are working on the issue. And then the third bit is both conducting our own research and then also fostering research with other partners to look at social norms in SEC. So first we'll talk about the conceptual clarity piece of it. So our first task was to immerse ourselves in the literature on SEC and understand the different definitions and the different conceptualizations of it. Internationally, there's a lot of different ways that it's thought of, and so we were trying to understand those complexities. We also did interviews with people who work in this area in Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, and Europe to understand. So for example, there's an organization in the UK called Bernardo's that works with victims of exploitation. So we talked with them about how they think about it, what they consider exploitation, and then compared and contrasted that with other organizations. For the desk review piece, we found that there are a ton of different definitions of SEC. There's literature from international agreements, regional agreements, like the EU Commission has their own definition, UN documents, and then different NGOs. They all have different definitions that have some similarities but different nuances. So there's a lot of inconsistency in the field. I just wanted to share one definition, which is a pretty broad one, and this is used in the UK, by the UK Department for Education. It was developed in 2009, and they're actually currently reviewing it, so it's probably going to change again in the next year. So I'll give you just a minute to read over that. And one thing I wanted to emphasize about this, so it's describing sexual activities with children where the children or a third person receives something in exchange for it. And that something can be defined really broadly. So traditionally, sex work, would be sex in exchange for money. Sexual exploitation can be sex in exchange for food, accommodation. They use a lot of different examples, and it can be even as vague as sex in exchange for affection, which could arguably be any relationship, potentially. So it's a pretty broad definition, and it covers a lot of ground. But we did find in our review of the definitions that there were some key themes that popped up pretty consistently. So there's a victim, and it's a child, and that's usually defined as someone who's under the age of 18. And there's a perpetrator, usually thought to be an adult, but there's increasing recognition that children could exploit other children as well. The victim has to be, for most definitions, in some sort of condition of vulnerability. So that could be at the individual level, like the cognitive disability, or being an orphan, or living in an institution. It could also be broader, like living in an area of conflict or living in poverty. And I think at least most definitions of sexual exploitation involve an abuse of power that the perpetrator has over the victim. That's one of the defining characteristics. And then the most consistent defining characteristic is that there's an exchange of some sort, so up with something that makes a little more sense than that pile of papers. So now I'll talk a little bit about the LINEA network. So it is a community of practice bringing together people from different areas of work who address SEC. So that includes funders and researchers like us, also programmers and implementers, and people who work on policy. And the goal is to promote social norms as an approach to primary prevention of SEC. And we're doing that, the network is doing that by serving as a resource to build capacity among its members, and then also serving as a platform for members to talk with each other and learn from each other, especially across disciplines and across sectors. So some of the activities that we undertake through the network are annual meetings. We've had one annual meeting so far. Hopefully it will become annual when we have the next one next year. Webinars, we have bi-monthly webinars. And then a big piece of the work that's just ongoing is translating what we learned from research into practice. So looking at how to best disseminate research findings to the field so that they can be taken up and used in programming and interventions. This is a map that shows the countries where we have LINEA network members, so 1 pin per country. The network's been around for about a year, and we have, this is as of March 2015, representation from about 35 different countries in most major regions. These pins show the countries where the members are based. A lot of the members that are based in places like the US, Canada, and the UK, their work is taking place in developing countries, but that's where their offices are based. So we have, I think we had about 220 members when this map was made, and we're now up to about 250. So as you can see, it's a pretty broad representation, but this map, I know it's a little bit light, but hopefully you can see it. So these dots show, it's a bigger dot means we've got more members in that region. So we're pretty heavily represented in the US and the UK, and some of our work in developing the network next year will be trying to connect with more people who are based in other regions. I think that the majority being in the US and UK is sort of an artifact of where our contacts are as the people who have been developing the network. So we want to expand that and make sure that we're serving as a resource more broadly. This is a photo from the first LINEA meeting, which was in March 2015. This was the first ever, and we had about 40 participants, and they kind of represented the network. They came from a range of backgrounds. So we had, one cool thing about it was that there were funders there, and then there were researchers and programmers who were giving talks describing what they needed funding for. So hopefully that will translate into funding for them. I think one of the biggest accomplishments of this meeting is that we had people from the HIV prevention field there, and we also had people from the child protection field, like UNICEF. And one of the things that we found is that they were working on some similar issues. So a lot of the programming in both of those areas is trying to protect and improve the lives of adolescents, especially adolescent girls. But they were using really different languages, and in some cases there have been some animosity on different sides because they tend to take different approaches. So one cool thing about the meeting was that we had folks telling us afterwards that they were, for the first time, able to find kind of common cause across these different approaches. And that, I think, is one of our biggest hopes for the network. So we have a page up, which our communications person, Michelle, has put up, that has resources from the meeting. So it's all the slides and some recorded presentations from those 3 days of the meeting. And it spanned everything from this is the way that childhood is thought of in a particular region in Ghana, to here's a specific intervention we're trying to develop in Brazil to prevent truck drivers from purchasing sex from underage girls. So it was really pretty broad. And I think we'll be able to make the PDF of the slides available afterwards, and this page is a link, so you could follow the link if you wanted to check out the resource page. And as I mentioned, we also do webinars. So we've had 6 so far. They're roughly every other month. And some have been presented by NGOs that we work with. Some have been presentations by researchers. We had one presentation by the former UN Special Rapporteur on sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography. That was the most well attended, I would say. And all of the webinars that we hold, we post on the LINEA YouTube channel. And again, in the PDF, this is a link to the YouTube channel. And so I'll take this opportunity to plug our next webinar. It's going to be in January 2015. So I just mentioned there's a presentation at the LINEA meeting on an intervention in Brazil where they're working with truck drivers to, and it's interesting, it's a social norms prevention. So this came out of the World Childhoods Foundation's earlier research, where they found that truck drivers were one of the most common groups that were purchasing sex from underage girls. So they're developing an intervention that is using radio, since truck drivers spend a lot of time in their trucks, using a radio program to develop and foster a norm of truck drivers and adults as protectors of children. So sort of rather than saying don't have sex with underage girls, they're trying to foster a new idea that empowers the truck drivers. And so the researcher, Anna Flora Warnick, who's working on that, she presented that intervention and what it is about at the meeting, and she'll be presenting findings from the first evaluation of the program in January. Okay. That's so loud. Can you hear me? Am I loud enough? Okay. Right. Okay, so now I'll talk about research projects that we're working on directly and some that we're fostering on social norms and SEC. So first, it's probably important to talk a little bit about what we mean by social norms. That term, norm, is used in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different disciplines to mean a lot of different things. And in LINEA, we're using one specific definition of that. I should say I've shamelessly stolen these slides from Lori Hygiene, but I've cited her. And she gave a really excellent overview of social norms and how it can be used to inform interventions. She gave that at the LINEA meeting, and there's a link right here, again in the PDF, to her presentation. I just rewatched it yesterday, and I would definitely recommend it if you're interested in the topic. She's a really good speaker and gives a really good, clear overview. But I'm going to use her slides just a little bit to say that, so norms, in the way that we're using them, are essentially social, meaning they have to do with your relationship with other people. So some other types of norms that people talk about, one type of norm is a statistical regularity, so the average number of rooms per household in Dakar, we might call that a norm. Social norms are let me jump down actually to moral norms. So a moral norm is something that someone's morally obliged to follow, whether or not other people believe they should. So an example, I was just talking about this with my partner Ben yesterday, who said, well, maybe an example of that, which I think is a good example, is that if somebody gives you too much change, you might return it to that cashier because you feel like it's not ethical for you to take it. Nobody's necessarily expecting that of you or would know if you didn't do it, but you do it because it appeals to a higher belief system that you have. Social norms, on the other hand, have everything to do with other people and their expectations. So social norms are what people in a group believe to be typical and believe to be appropriate. So this is sort of a more comprehensive definition. A norm is a set of social expectations that are shared within a valued reference group. And a reference group is relevant others who hold these social expectations of one another. And I think it's important to note one person can have multiple reference groups that they look to meet expectations and understand what they should be doing. So for example, a student in a master's program at LSHCM, you might have your other students that you look to sort of see what they expect of you and try to meet those expectations. Another reference group might be your lecturers or professors and the expectations that they set within the school. But then you might also have as your reference group your family, which may have really different expectations or different norms, so you can navigate between multiple reference groups. And I think the key thing about social norms is that they are maintained by social influence. So it's your expectations of what will happen if you conform to them or you don't conform to them that determine like how well you'll follow that norm. So there's social influence of approval, including anticipation of positive sanctions if you do what is expected, and disapproval, including anticipation of negative sanctions if you don't do it. So there's two types of norms that are recognized by social psychologists, or kind of two pieces to it. So one is descriptive norms, or what someone thinks that others are doing. So for example, if there's a student at university living in a dorm, they have an estimation of the percentage of other students in that dorm that they think drink alcohol. So that's a descriptive norm. How many other people, like if they think most other students in my dorm drink, that's a descriptive norm. Injunctive norms are what one thinks others believe should be done. So using that same example, an injunctive norm would be the belief everybody in my dorm expects me to drink, or everyone in my dorm thinks that it's really bad if I drink alcohol. So both of those things can influence behavior. Injunctive norms are crucial because they distinguish social norms from other types of social practices. And descriptive and injunctive norms usually are in line with each other, but not always. So the example that Lori gave of when they might conflict is paying your taxes. You could say, I think everyone, I think I'm expected to pay my taxes, it's the right thing to do, but I also don't think anyone else is, so why should I do it? So that's just an example of where they could conflict. Any questions on that? We can do questions at the end, too. If there are norms that are underpinning a behavior, then that behavior is unlikely to change without addressing the relevant norms. But not all behavior is driven by norms. So this approach is only really appropriate if you've diagnosed that norms are present and they need to change for the behavior to change. So just some examples of behaviors not driven by norms. Wearing a coat when it's cold outside. Maybe people will look at you a little funny if you go outside without a coat and it's really cold, but primarily you do it because you're going to be cold otherwise. So that's driven by a personal preference, not by necessarily social sanctions for not doing it. And then example of behaviors that are driven by norms. I think this one is really easy to visualize. So rituals of respect at funerals. There are certain things you would do or not do at a funeral, and those things might vary based on your culture or where you are. But those are firmly ensconced in expectations of what's appropriate and what other people are going to be doing. So then there are some key questions to consider when diagnosing whether a behavior is driven by norms or not. So the first is the behavior driven by beliefs about what others do and what they expect you to do? So is it underpinned by descriptive and injunctive norms? Would you still act the same way even if others disagreed? And are there consequences of departing from that behavior? Would there be sanctions, social sanctions if you didn't do it? And then this is just a quick slide to note that there are a lot of different factors that influence behavior. So social norms are one of them, but those are often tied up and connected in this web to attitudes, which is how favorably or unfavorably you assess a particular thing, and also factual beliefs, and schemas, scripts, and stereotypes. I'm not going to get into that, but Lori's talk has a really good section on those. So this is just one example of the different types of factors that might be that could influence partner violence. So there's factual beliefs. Women won't obey unless they're beaten, or women need discipline in order to be good wives. Positive attitudes towards the practice. So hitting is an acceptable form of discipline. That is a positive attitude towards hitting. Normative expectations. So with partner violence, in some contexts, it's a norm and it's accepted. In a lot of contexts, that actual behavior isn't accepted, but there might be other norms that underpin it or support it. So one example is other men will look down upon a man who cannot keep his wife in line. That could be a norm that's supporting hitting your wife, even if people don't like to see you do it. That norm could still support the practice. And then other norms like disclosing violence would bring shame upon the family, so you don't do it. And then scripts, just to mention briefly. So script is sort of a pattern. It comes from cognitive science. Maybe someone else knows more about it than I do. But it has to do with patterns that develop in the way that you think about a particular thing. So your concept of what a good wife is and does, those can influence it as well. So coming from that background, our sort of first research step was to do a literature review to look at what the social norms and structural factors are that are related to SEC. We did not find, so we looked at studies, both published and unpublished, and we didn't find any studies that actually looked at this question. So typically with a review, you would say, well, what did everyone else find when they looked at this? And now I'm going to compile it and synthesize it. But from what we found, no one else has specifically looked at this. So instead, we're looking for references to elements of social norms that could kind of indicate what norms are supporting SEC. And we're also looking at other more conventional structural factors. So drawing from social norm theory, in the literature, we were trying to tease out what is known about social norms supporting the practice by looking at references to beliefs about what others do and what others think people should do. Descriptions or comments related to a reference group. So, for example, if I am not having sex with a girl, like all of my friends are going to think that I am not a good, like that I'm a dork, or that I'm not a good man, that I'm not very masculine. So yeah, what other people think. And then also behavior that's maintained by social influences of approval and disapproval. So these are just some of the preliminary findings from the literature review. We'll have it finished by the end of the month. We're in the process of writing it up now. But just some of the key findings. On the social norm side, we found a lot of evidence of status, primarily among girls, talking about their status in their peer group being tied to what consumer goods they have, having a nice phone, having nice clothes, and that seemed to be a driver for some women or some girls of exchanging sex for money or goods. Also found evidence of sexual expectations for girls that contribute to SEC. So one example is that in some contexts there were social sanctions. If a girl was having sex with a guy and she wasn't getting anything in return, or she wasn't getting enough in return, she was embarrassed, and her friends in some contexts thought less of her because she was giving it away for free when she could be getting something. Also for men, prestige associated with having younger partners. And then the last point we found kind of cuts both ways. So norms ask, right, how common do you think it is that other people are doing this? In some settings, people said, no one, like, it would be really looked down on, and no one in my community thinks it's right or is having sex with younger girls. That's not common in my community. It's very rare. And then in some other communities, some of the men who talked about this in the study said, like, this is really common. Everybody is doing this. It's fine. In terms of structural factors, I think, as you could imagine, poverty and economic hardship could be a driver, or there was evidence of that. Limited job options, so especially for girls, in a lot of settings they have really limited access to cash or ways that they can get cash, and in some cases that's combined with an expectation that they'll be contributing financially to their family, so that's sort of a perfect storm. And then economic inequalities. So one example of that, there was one study in Peru that was, it took place in a town that was historically impoverished, but then there was an influx of cash from new timber and hydrocarbon trade. So all of a sudden there were a lot of men there bringing in a lot of money, but the families living there didn't have a lot of money. So you've got this clash of economic inequalities, and a high cash flow is really conducive to purchasing and selling sex. Another study that we're doing, so that's the literature review. So now I'll talk about some of the field research that we're working on. Anna Maria Buller is leading our partnership with Brazil. There's an organization called Promundo Brazil we're working with, and she's working with them to design a study to look at sexual exploitation of children and adolescents in favelas in Rio de Janeiro. So in January of 2015, she went out there and helped organize a workshop, a couple-day workshop training Promundo and their partners on social norms and the social norms approach. And now they're in the process of finalizing their protocol, and they're going to be doing interviews and focus groups with young men and stakeholders in the area, adolescents and other young adults, looking at the norms that support sexual exploitation. And I think they're also using a really interesting design, so it's mixed methods. First, they're going to do some qualitative research to explore what factors are supporting exploitation. And based on those findings, they're going to develop a scale to measure those factors. And then they'll go back and do follow-up focus groups after they run the quantitative research using the scale that they've developed. They're going to go back and do focus groups in the community to help them interpret the findings and see if it matches up with people's real experiences. And those are some photos from Anna Maria's trip to Brazil. That's her. And some really beautiful art that she found. Another study that we are working on setting up is a multi-country study on social norms. And this one, it's a new acronym, CSEC. That stands for Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children. So this study is focusing specifically on the formal sale of sex. So looking at men who purchase sex from girls under 18 and the girls who sell sex. So this is led by a consultant we're working with in DC, and the LSHTM team is working with her. And Patty Patesh, who's the consultant, she's an expert in qualitative comparative methodology that she's bringing into this project. I'm new to it, so I can't talk too much about it. But I know that it's taking place likely in 4, potentially up to 6 countries, and we're still determining which countries. But it's going to involve interviews and focus groups again. And I think with any norms research, we'll be looking at the girls who are victims, but then also the men who are buying sex, and then other adults in the community to understand what the whole range of thoughts around this is what are sort of the norms in the community that are supporting it.